Welcome to Sunrise Extra on a Thursday. I'm glad you're on the stream. Today we're diving into a big topic. So in just a second we'll introduce our special guest. But so much has happened in Portland. We wanted to kind of look back over the last 16 months or so since the George Floyd murder and everything that has transpired, the social justice movements, the downtown protests, the ones that turned into riots, just police reform. I mean, it is a big, big topic. So helping us out this morning, kind of put everything into context locally, is the president of the NAACP, Ms. Sharon. Yes, there she is, Gary Smith. I was waiting for your pretty face to show up this morning. Sharon, thank you so much for joining us. This really is something that I want to, like I said, put into context because emotions run hot when it comes to these difficult topics. But can you start by telling us today, George Floyd's birthday? He would have been 48. Why is this recognized? Why is this day important to many people in the social justice movement?
Thank you for asking me. When I think of 48 and I just had my latest turn around the sun, what we call birthdays or my born day, it is a day that marks your existence for another year. It is a day when your loved ones, when others around you celebrate you, they recognize you, they acknowledge you. For me, it's a day when I am actually looking back at what I had planned, what I've accomplished, what remains to be done. Where am I in the work of making the world better? And the birthday of a man who was murdered on May 25th of 2020, murdered, taken away from us, however we think about him, a black man who was a father. That galvanizing moment is filled with sorrow and sadness and disappointment that this continues. So George Floyd's birthday is a marker for measuring how far we've come and how far we still have to go in this city, in this state, and certainly in this country.
I can hear some people watching thinking, but why should we recognize this man? He wasn't the pinnacle, he wasn't an MLK. How would you respond to those critics who say the life that he led shouldn't be held up?
I must say, as a native of a Portland, Oregonian by birth, the idea that we choose and decide who matters, and far too often it's along racial lines. I can say that as a black woman in Oregon, that there is speculation about the proof of his life having value. He was a human. However we think what went down on May 25th, we lost a father. We lost a son who cried for his mother in the last moments while the knee was on his neck, taking away life from him. We can presume he was a bad man, but bad men have been in positions of authority and power recently and over a long period of time. They didn't have George Floyd's skin color, and therefore they had a different outcome in far too many instances. He mattered because he was a human.
Sharon, it has been about a year and a half now since George Floyd's death. You mentioned back in May of last year, 2020. I'm curious, of course, that death sparked movements not only across this country, but around the world. But speaking of the movements here in Portland, how has the city changed? And I'm talking about change for the better because of those movements, because that was the idea, right? We want to change, we want a positive change. Can you talk about some of those changes?
I think what's important is that the movements had been going on far before there had been numerous deaths of black men and women and children prior to George Floyd. That for me was enough is enough. And the entire world saw, all around the world, the power of video recording on phones was definitely a part of this. Portland, like so many other places, responded with solidarity statements, with vows to do better and to do better for those underserved, those marginalized, otherized, which are typically African American, other people of color, LGBTQ communities, disabled. We made a decision that we could do something different, our city, to those who have not been in the decision making or a part of the idea of change. Some of it was performative. In some cases, we've seen some movement, more ideas around how to engage community in government services, in decision making, in planning for a future we all hope to see, or those who come behind us. Some is about housing, and you've seen the results of attempting to house so many people who've been pushed out and marginalized when their communities are gentrified. It's not going that well, but there's lots of talk about it. It's a very slow process to get to action. Some are young people who feel they don't matter. They're not seen, they're criminalized. We have a long way to go on that to cause people to believe they're included when the evidence is they haven't been, and they're not until they're a problem. So we have an uneven balance, I think, between wishes and desires, intention and outcomes in this city in ways we've never seen it before.
Sharon, you grew up in Portland. You've seen the city change a lot, and boy, has it changed a lot in so many ways, in the past, 5 years, but especially in the past 2 years. We're going through a homeless crisis, like you mentioned. We now have record gun violence going on in the city. And you said something really poignant that city leaders are trying to kind of address through more community-led efforts and less policing. Talk about kind of where you think some of this gun violence is stemming from, and it really comes kind of from within and starting from young boys, right?
Absolutely. Young boys and young girls of color who do not see themselves in any of these planning procedures, any of these processes, until they are heard and seen in ways that we don't consider to be useful. I think I mentioned that when City Hall takes up the responsibility to serve its citizens, who do they see as important and a part of the equation? Young people say, young people of color say, the young people we work with say, it's not us. We're criminalized. We're discouraged from being a part of the landscape. We're assumed to be a problem. And the history supports that. Elders who used to be the kind of buffer between city and services and police are disappointed at the responses to communities as they've changed or have become on the edges and not the communities that get served first. So there's a lack of hope in many cases. There's evidence that that lack of hope is actually true. There is some effort to include community by coming to community and asking what you think after the plans have been developed. That's not community engagement. That's just input. There are still the same influencers who don't look like me, who get to set the standards at far too many tables. I say we change the table, or we break the table up, and we have more representative, inclusive processes to figure out what works better for more of us.
So
it can
Sharon,
be done.
Let me just hop in for a second, because if you could, can you give me one or two ways, concrete ways, specifics, that we can instill hope in some of the very people that you work with every day and that you're talking about right now?
I believe the NAACP is a long-standing, 109 years here in Portland, Oregon, and in the state of Oregon, believes that we can have a accountability and presence of those who are sworn to protect and serve all of us. That we can have a balance between community safety, which used to be what I remember, where folks on the block are watching, where folks on the block are talking and engage with police and others who are supposed to serve, but they're not weaponized. They are recognized as community guardians. They don't have to be elders, although I'm one now. We can engage better in how we draw youth to tell us about a future they see or desire, and be patient enough to allow them to design it with us, not after the fact. We can look at housing for those who lost homes and are now placed in apartments that are called affordable housing. We have to reckon with what we haven't done for so many, particularly African Americans, displaced, pushed out, gentrified over them, have to acknowledge and do more than these small little efforts to house some. We have to be more compassionate and more patient, because the process of engagement is messy. And sometimes the idea of satisfying business owners or downtown or certain sectors, as opposed to those who waited so long, we have to be willing to do the hard work and to do it with more people who represent this city in this state. And I think that that's a push and pull. We've done 109 years of hope and push and questioning and being willing to be at the tables. And so you have to have a long haul view, and you have to have some short victories. If we don't figure it out with these young people, if we don't figure out over policing, since George Floyd, there have been so many more murders of Black men and women and children. And we have to acknowledge that something about that is clearly more than just their problem.
Well, in the few minutes we have left, Sharon, we could easily continue to talk about the gun violence issue in the city, but I also want to talk again about the homeless issue in the city. I know you talked one-on-one with Brenda earlier, and she shared a few of the takeaways from that conversation. And one that stood out to me was the fact that you think by the end of this year, the homeless situation, the homeless crisis in Portland will only get worse, and it has to do with people of color not being counted. Can you explain that for me? Maybe connect the dots and explain what that means exactly?
Well, because we're relational people, people of color actually have family, biological, as well as family that is around you. People, cousins and others that you didn't really know them all the time, but they become a part of the more fluid nuclear family. We're not always showing up in the shelters. We're not always showing up in spaces that are being counted. We are folks who take in those who have no place to go, until it becomes such a difficult circumstance, too many people in a small space. They move on to somebody else. They move on to somebody else. They move to places where they feel that they are secure. So they may not show up in the numbers, but the numbers of our young people of color and our families of color are large proportionately to the count of who's visible in this city as houseless. And when we lose homes we own that have been generational homes, to the gentrification that is explosive in Portland, in fact, it leads the country, then people are hanging on by a thread and they're offered very little for what has been built in their family. They lose wealth, they lose security, they lose an address that belongs to them. And so we have to acknowledge and do more. And especially in the communities that were culturally communities of African Americans, albino.
So Sharon, tell me.
Do more.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Oh no, I was just saying.
I didn't mean to cut you off. Yeah. Can you tell me, because I know when we think of the NAACP, unfortunately, you guys have been in the news for controversy. You are a new president. The last one was out of there after allegations, which he denies, of misconduct of all kinds. But now that you're trying to be more transparent, you're trying to move forward there, as you told me, you're looking for a new day from here on out. Can you give us last word on some of the things that you are working on as an organization from this day forward? What should people know?
We are very much about the policies and those laws that pass in this state that can amplify and elevate and provide more opportunity for African Americans and other people of color. We want to see some parity. We want to see equitable opportunities for wealth building, as I mentioned, economic development. We're very much about economic development over a longer period, contracting, the practices that need to change in how contracts are awarded. It's still abysmal. There has been a bump. We make a part of the discussion young people's involvement, their leadership, their engagement, so that elders like me sit at the table and listen to young people like I used to be, and actually develop practices and procedures and opportunities to engage them early and longer in the move for justice, racial and social justice. Because when you build that, everybody gets benefit, not just some. And we believe that young people are, in fact, the future. And I'd like to give them a better city and certainly a better world than the one they're inheriting.
Well, Brenda gave you the proper introduction at the start of this conversation, and I will try to give you the proper goodbye. She is Sharon Gary Smith. She is the new president of the Portland chapter of the NAACP. Sharon, we thank you for joining us today here on Sunrise
Thank you for
Extra.
having me.
You're welcome.
That'll do it for us on the stream today. We will be back tomorrow on Facebook and YouTube. Have a good day, you guys.
Bye.